So we are here on the Mount Carmel in Haifa, in Israel. Just had a packed hall, about 200 people.
Amazing.
Half of them more or less stayed for the Q&A. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to say before we start, and maybe I will ask some questions, and then we'll go to the audience, to the public, to make some questions, or to ask them, that I saw your film first time 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I was simply mesmerized by it. I mean, I was, of course, a fan, or not, of course, a fan of Beast of the, and I thought it was moving. It is. I think it is a bold interpretation of Peter Pan, and we will talk about it. I want to start by asking, what is, or who is Peter Pan for you?
You know, the thing about Peter is I don't remember a time before Peter existed in my life. You know, he's someone that I always felt was there from when I can remember, you know, and it was interesting. It's true for my sister, Eliza, who I wrote this film with and who did the production design. You know, we didn't think of him as like a character from a story. We thought of him as like a, you know, like a god or something, or like a pixie that was like out in the world somewhere. And our whole life, our whole childhood, we're trying to like be the type of kid that Peter would come and knock on the window and take us away. And then he never came, you know? And so instead we grew up and we went out to find him, basically. And this film is kind of the result of that adventure, trying to go search for Peter Pan in the real world, search for Neverland in the real world, and to live this story that we kind of dreamed about our entire life.
Okay, so why is Wendy in the center of your film?
I think that because, you know, a story is usually about someone who changes, you know, and Peter never changes, you know, that is who he is, and he's frozen in time. And I thought that also, you know, really what we were interested in, you know, partly I'm interested, you know, I love the history of this story and this character, but I think that what I was really interested in making a film about was really the story of growing up that we all tell to ourselves and is told, you know, and what I mean by that is, like, you know, from when you're very young, you understand this very strange story about your own life, which is that at the beginning, you're the most sort of pure, you have the most fun, and then you're wild for a time and free for a time. And then at some point you have to give all that up. Your dreams will change, you take on responsibility, you get weaker, and you get until you die. And it's like this horrible story that we all are told, and over and over and over again, the world tells us this story. And I think that in the moment where I made this film, I was sort of making this transition from being like a very, whatever, sort of young artist, you know, working in this sort of utopian state. And I was being told like, oh, everything's going to be different now, you know, and it reminded me of being a kid and hearing that when I grew up, everything was going to be different. And so I wanted to make this film sort of to challenge that story, you know, and to recognize that it's a story. Really, Wendy's character who has to, who her story is about going and sort of seeing this world, but then having to then grow up, you know, and then having to complete the story of growing up and live in the real world and go to the real world knowing that there is this place of eternal youth. And I thought through her character, by changing her character in the story, we could tell a version of the story of growing up that isn't this sort of horrific, oppressive, nightmare that children fear, that grown-ups are burdened by. And I thought Wendy was almost sort of the key to unlock this other interpretation of what it means to get old.
Thank you for this answer. I never thought about this aspect of Peter Pan, that he never changes, and therefore maybe he's not an interesting character for even for a book or for a film. And yes, of course, Wendy is going through this change, and it's a little bit well. If we talk about a tragic destiny or universe, then Peter's is certainly the undercurrent of the novel and of the mythology of Peter is tragic. And in a way, because as you said, it tackles maybe one of the worst fears of people, of humans, and that's getting old. And on that level, I wanted to ask you about your your wonderful invention. I like to call it the origins of Captain Hook. Maybe if Marvel will take Peter Pan, or God forbid, yes, but it will take Peter Pan and will make the universe of Peter Pan. Then maybe your starting point could be another film called The Origins of Captain Hook, because Captain Hook in your film is not the arch villain, the sworn enemy of Peter Pan, although Peter said it in the end, but it's almost like a joke. He's just one of these kids that grew, or they didn't have the, I don't know what, in order not to grow up. Maybe he was too sad, and then he grew up. And then it's just a sad, tragic character. So I'm wondering how you thought about it. When you thought about how to portray Captain Hook in your film, in your interpretation.
I think we wanted, sort of the exact story that I was just talking about. We wanted to really make that the burden of Captain Hook, that, because I always felt that way in the original story, that these pirates, and when you think about real pirate, like these are people who grow older but never evolve. They're playing the same games. That everything is about pleasure in the moment. They have these same qualities of sort of being like children that don't evolve. And we wanted to create a character in Hook that, whereas Wendy is able to sort of like, evolve and think through how things are changing and process tragedy and move on, and all these things that we have to, as you grow up, you are confronted by and you have to overcome, and create a character in Hook that does not do this, where a single tragedy breaks his whole life and he's unable to move on from it. He's unable to sort of move on from the idea that childhood was the best moment of his life. And in, and in the mythology of our film, his angst and his anger and the pain around wanting to hold on to that causes him to get old very quickly. And we thought it'd be very powerful to sort of see that happen within the context of twins, and to see very sort of visually how depending on how you sort of react to this tragedy that they go through, that one twin would stay young and then face his brother when he's older, and sort of hopefully sort of visually represent the kind of pain that Captain Hook is going through, the fact that he wasn't able to stay young and control this sort of sadness that overtook him.
I think this idea of seeing yourself, because they are twins, almost yourself in your older version. Yes, again, it's one of the maybe worst fears that we have, is reenacting again in the end scene when Wendy is running after the train, and she understands that she is old now and she can get the train, and her daughter is in her place on the train. Okay, someone from the audience want to, yes. Always from the audience is asking about the casting process. How long did it last? And if you can elaborate a little bit about the process of casting the film.
Sure, yeah. It was very, very long. I think another thing, I was going to mention this earlier, but it's connected to sort of who I think Peter is. For me, one of the ways that I really hated all of the various versions of Peter Pan is that Peter Pan was always portrayed by somebody much older. The character was always like 11 or 12 years old, or he was played by an adult pretending to be a child. And really, when I think about Peter, and even from the original book, I always felt that Peter was a very, very young child, and that's what's so tragic about his life, is that he never has reached the point where he has empathy or love or understands family. Like he's caught before this moment, and he's frozen there in time. And so we wanted to find a very young child for his role. And obviously that dictated that all the children had to be quite young. We knew we weren't going to find actors, that age who could play these roles. We wanted to find children who felt like they belonged in the story, who would actually run away with Peter Pan if Peter Pan showed up. And so we we looked for, we looked for very young children. It took a long time, especially to find Yashua, who plays Peter, who's from the Caribbean island where we shot on. And when we cast them, they were really too young to be in a film, and they didn't have the skills necessary. Like Peter was 5 when we cast him. He couldn't really read. He couldn't swim. So from the point we cast the characters, that was almost 2 years before shooting. We just sort of made a decision that these were the kids, and we were going to really spend the next 2 years working with them, teaching them how to act, helping them understand the story. Devin was afraid to climb a tree. By the end of it, she had to dive off of platforms backwards on a bungee cord. Like, it took a long time to sort of develop these skills with these kids. And that was part of we just sort of committed to them, and it was part of the adventure, but it took a long time to find them and then a long time for them to become the people that could act in this film.
I saw some of the PR photos for the film, and in all the photos, you are there with the kids playing like a kid. We'll talk about your kidness, if I may say so, related to the work in front or vis-a-vis the studios, but maybe later. All right, another? Yes. And Moshe from Moses from the from the audience is asking about the process of writing the soundtrack of the film, composing it. I mean, it's beautiful. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, it was an interesting discovery. The soundtrack evolved in a couple of different ways. We knew that there was this one song that was going to be sung in the film by the characters and by the mother. And normally I write all the music for the film afterwards, but this song had to exist before we shot, so the music came in much earlier than I think in a normal film. And we wanted it to kind of have this quality, like a very simple melody that could be a lullaby in a certain moment, that could be a pirate sea shanty in a certain moment, that could be epic, that could be tender, So we needed this very simple, versatile song to kind of center everything on. And it kind of expanded out from there. And, I would say about the sort of thinking of it, like one thing I discovered, I spent a lot of time just playing with the kids, as you're maybe referring to. Long before we made the film, I would just go out, we would go to the woods, I would just set them free, run around, see what happened, try to understand it. And one thing that I sort of realized is that they never would get into long conversations, and no one would ever like express a thought or monologue. If somebody started talking too much, the other kids would run away. Like no scenes were happening. It was just this kind of momentum and this kind of game that would change and evolve and continue. And initially I'd written a script with a lot more speaking in it, especially from Peter. He would like make these big speeches, and and eventually I realized that just wasn't true to kind of how the kids were. And I ended up pulling out a lot of the dialogue and kind of knowing that the way that we were going to sort of express the feeling of the film, the emotion, what the kids were thinking was going to be through sort of a broadcast from their heads in a way. And so the music became this sort of expression of like what the kids feel are happening, which is oftentimes not as grand as what is actually happening. So we knew that there was going to be this, oftentimes it's just kids running around, they're playing in the woods. They're nothing that dangerous or that exciting is happening, but for them, sliding down a hill on a piece of plastic is like the most fun thing that's ever happened. And we needed to let the music kind of express how much of an adventure they felt they were on, even if it wasn't like what was actually necessarily happening. And so that sort of informed a lot of the thinking around the music and why it sort of needed to go so huge at times and be kind of a real sort of expression, of emotion at all times of where the kids were and what they were thinking.
Yes. Okay. Avi is asking, stating that the center of your both films are in the center of your both film, you put girls. Why is that?
I don't know. I don't know that I mean, I don't think there's a broader idea. I think that, it's sort of the two films in some ways are flowed into one another, I would say. When we were making Beasts, it wasn't actually a certainty that that character was going to be a girl. The initial play that it's based on is actually about a young boy. But then kind of as we were casting, and then of course, when we found Quvenzhané, that sort of took the whole movie in its own direction. She became the center of it. And then actually when I was going into writing Wendy, I had the incredibly delusional idea that I was going to make this fast enough that she could be Wendy. And a lot of sort of the character and why I was so interested in, I think of them as very different. They're very different characters. And part of it was that, Quvenzhané was 6 when she did Beast This Other Wild. By the time we were sort of going on the promotional campaign, she was turning 10. And I'd seen her change and sort of be confronted by these things about growing up and facing the real world that were so connected to the themes of this film. And so in many ways, she herself inspired me to center the film around this character and make this film as my next film. And I thought that I was going to get it done to where she could be Wendy. By the time we shot Wendy, she was like taller than me. So that didn't happen.
All right. Another question from the audience? Yes. Ella is asking, how long did it take to write the script? The process, of course.
I never really stopped writing scripts. The period of only writing that was about a year long at the beginning. And then that script was just sort of what me and my sister Eliza imagined. And then there was a very, very long revision process that really involved, which was sort of how I've done all of my films, like the casting and the scouting sort of caused the script to change. We like our scripts to stay flexible, to sort of be able to incorporate an amazing person if we meet them, so none of these things were sort of set. Like the genders of the kids weren't set. When we sort of went to the island of Montserrat, found this volcano, the volcano sort of changed the whole mythology of the film. I started exploring Montserrat. I found the sort of didn't find it, but was introduced to the buried city. That became a whole new element of the film. So all of those things, as we sort of went through the other processes of developing the film, we part of the idea was that the script would bend and change and be revised and sort of in rehearsal be changed. It was a constant iteration, really all the way through shooting, because the film, as you may or may not be able to tell, was incredibly unpredictable, and we're shooting with all that can't be controlled. It's children, it's water, it's volcanoes, just natural disasters happening that change, what you can film on any given day. And I've always sort of liked that process, and I felt it was right for this film that every day would sort of like become spontaneous. Nothing was ever exactly as you imagined. You couldn't sit down and just draw it all and get it. You would show up and encounter some crazy natural phenomenon. The beach that you were supposed to shoot on is no longer there. Something like, just crazy stuff. The volcano becomes unstable, something like that. So each day we sort of reshaped the story and improvised and, reacted to what nature was allowing us to do. So there's actually no final script for the film. I was asked to submit one, and I was like, I couldn't even tell you what to look at, because as we shot, it changed.
So let's take your last sentence. I was asked to submit one, and then let's talk about your, let's say, complex relationship with the studio, with the Searchlight. I read the interview you gave to Amir Bogen in Ynet. And I thought I recognized the music, the notes and the music of your complaints from big other directors in the 70s and in the 80s that were confronting, the studios. Like the studios are the big villains that rightly so or not rightly so, that interfere with the creative work. And I really want you to ask you because in the end of this very interesting interview, you said that you're happy, in a way that you are happy that this relationship was not so good, because now you understand what it is and you can go back to be a child or a child director than join the grown-ups who direct studio films?
Yeah, I mean, directing films is not something I consider to be a job, or a career. It's a dream, that I've always had, to sort of live this way and be able to make this type of art. And I should say, like, no one should ever complain about the opportunity to make a feature film. It was an incredible, anytime you get to do it, it's a miracle, but I do think that what I experienced that was really shocking in some ways to me, because I just didn't understand it when I went into it. It's just, the culture of my films is, as I was sort of saying, is all based on taking incredible chances and based on things that are unpredictable, and everything about the culture of how studios makes films is based on everything being planned and everything going as it's supposed to. And when those two cultures sort of meet one another, it really causes an incredible, detonation of just like, it's just two opposite philosophies on how to create art, really, and I think that there are some films and probably some filmmakers who work in a much more straightforward way, who are able to, who want to make the film that they wrote down on the page, and if you do that, I think the system can work for you. But if that isn't what you do, and if you want, the sort of freedom to change at any moment and to react to what's happening in front of you, and to not to shoot a film that's different from the one that you envision shooting, and to do things that will intentionally cause that to happen, like casting non-actors, like shooting on location, like every other choice that we made, you end up really in a war that the film is caught in the middle of, and it causes a lot of, damage to the film. It causes a lot of damage to the filmmakers, and probably the studio executives would tell you the same thing, that they, couldn't sleep at night and probably lost hair over dealing with this project, so it's just on both sides. It's like, it's different cultures that can't really, cooperate, properly, attempting to do something, and it can be really frustrating. And I think it was illuminating for me just how much my specific way I make things and like to work relies on an incredible amount of freedom. Not only, you think of creative freedom as in like, I can make whatever movie I want, but people often don't think about the process and how important the process is to what ends up on the screen. And I really like to sort of, there's a very set way of making films in Hollywood. It's very much like, it reminds me, it's like a military structure or something like that. It's very, very regimented. And it's very like, we do this, we do, and like, if that's not who you are and how you work, it doesn't really work for films like that, I would say.
Maybe it's the difference between industry and art, no? And there is a reason why Hollywood is defined by the film industry, like the term, the film industry. Industry is manufacturing products.
Exactly.
So maybe it's part of that. Okay, we have time for last question from the audience. If somebody wants to ask, yes, please. על העיצוב? ייצוג, okay, סליחה. The question is about, I want to try to interpret it well, the difference of representation, if there is, between girls and boys in the film. The gender difference, okay? If there is a gender difference in representation.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think it's character to character, you have one female Lost Boy who she sort of wants to be one of the boys. And so the film kind of treats her in that way, I think for Wendy, it's quite different. I think Wendy really wants to be a girl, and what that means, is obviously complicated, but I think that we really thought a lot about how gender historically has worked in this story, and especially, my sister, Eliza, this was always her favorite story in the world. And for her, it was always incredibly painful to go to Peter Pan and see every version of Peter Pan. And then while you're experiencing this incredible adventure, you're also experiencing a story that tells you that adventure is not for you. You know, the adventure is for the Lost Boys and for Peter and for the pirates, and the girl's role is to wait at home for them to come back, and then you fix their clothes, you put them to bed, and you worry about them all day long. You know, it's this incredibly demeaning, anti-female sort of point of view that the story basically has always had, different, you know, slightly different in different versions, but you know, that in combination with a related thing, which is that, you know, Wendy is sort of supposed to be the mother. You know, she's brought to be the mother of the Lost Boys, and motherhood in this story has always also been this, like, you know, weakness in a way. You know, like, oh, if you're the mother, you can't go out and have fun. You know, and we wanted to really strip that out of the story and kind of take on femininity and motherhood as this sort of superpower in this film, and create this hero called the mother, who they think of as the mother, who is not the weakness of anything. She's like the strongest force on the island. She's a volcano. She's the reason they stay young. She's sort of the center of miracles and magic in this story, which I think is accurate to the world as well. Like, the biggest miracle that all of us experience in our lives comes through birth and through motherhood, and our relationship with our mothers, you know, is always just something that is impossible to articulate and is so magical. We wanted to give motherhood and you know, femininity sort of not just equal footing with the boys or whatever, but this sort of magical sort of omnipresent strength that sort of defines the world of Wonderland in our interpretation of it.
I'm just wondering, after what you said, that maybe we will talk once again about your decision to take out Tinkerbell from the story, and what is the reason for that. Maybe because she's putting another tension in the story, which is maybe the tension of something that childs don't experience really. This is later, you know, falling in love or even jealousy, a sort of sexual jealousy. Yeah, I want to thank you very much for joining us live from the United States to Israel. And I want to promise you two things for your next project, film, art. We would love to have you, to extend an invitation and to have you here in your truly material, physical form on the Mount of Carmel. And we are in the Haifa Film Festival, very happy with art, not with industry. And so we will be very happy to screen your next film. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. I'll be there next time.
Keep safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.